Miles J. Connor was sitting in a federal prison in Chicago when arguably the greatest art heist of all time was committed. Many people proclaim Connor to be the greatest art thief that ever lived, one of these people being the head of security at the art museum at the center of the greatest art heist of all time. And it's not by coincidence that Connor's name is mentioned in connection with this particular art heist. Miles Connor had actually cased the Isabella Stewart Gardner Art Museum in 1975. 15 years before the heist took place. He cased it with a man he claims was one of the men in uniform who pulled off the heist, a local criminal named Bobby Donati. While the two men wandered among the paintings, sculptures, and treasures in 1975, they discussed what they would take if they were to pull it off. Two curious items were mentioned. Souvenirs, if you will. Mementos of pulling off such a big job. A 12th century Shang Dynasty gu for Connor, and a bronze eagle finial that topped a Napoleonic banner for Donati. That heist that they discussed came into being in the early morning hours of March 18, 1990. At the time, the greatest art thief who ever lived was 1,000 miles away in his federal prison cell. Yet, among the priceless works of art stolen, works by Rembrandt, Degas, Manet, and Vermeer, were two small items that were barely noticed at first. It was only after museum officials did a thorough sweep of the museum that they discovered a bronze eagle finial and an ancient Chinese vessel were missing too. In a case that has spanned 30 years, involved the local police, the FBI, art experts across the globe, the entire Boston Mafia, and theories ranging from the incredibly wild to the incredibly simple. Could the best theory of the world's biggest art heist have come from the world's greatest art thief himself? Hi, my name is Jaime Lee and I'm a mixed media artist. Here on my channel, I do time-lapse art videos. I talk about mixed media art supplies and techniques, and I also talk about stories dealing with art that I find fascinating, and I hope you do as well. In today's video, we will be talking about the Isabella Stewart Gardner Art Museum heist, where in the span of 81 minutes, two men stole 13 priceless works of art, valued at somewhere between $500 to $600 million, and then vanished into the Boston night. What vanished with them was the art. In the 30 years since that night, not one piece has been recovered, and not one person has been arrested for the crime. In fact, there are as many questions left unanswered today as there were in the days following the heist, now known as the largest U.S. property theft in history. These are questions that the world's top law enforcement officers and art theft experts have tried and failed to answer. Of course, if you check into the official outcome of this story, according to the FBI, they know who the two men who entered the museum and stole the 13 works of art are. They have said that both of the suspects are now dead. However, that doesn't fully explain all of the other questions surrounding this particular heist. For example, who told these men to break into the museum, because it sure as heck wasn't their idea. They were working for an individual or a group or something else in order to get those paintings. They were just, so to speak, the fall guys. Where did the paintings go? The FBI has said that they tracked the paintings to Connecticut and Philadelphia, but have since lost the trail. As of today, the artworks are still unaccounted for, and it seems nobody knows where they have gone. And of course, if you get into unofficial versions of what happened, there are more players, there are more theories, and there are more likely scenarios than most people even know what to do with. So I split this tale into two videos since there is so much information to cover. Part 1 is an overview of the museum and the crime itself. Part 2 will be the suspects, the theories, and what could be the most likely answer to this unsolved crime. "81 minutes. The facts of this heist remain pretty much unchanged in every telling. Two men in uniform. Most accounts say two men dressed in Boston Police Department uniforms, but this is actually inaccurate. The two men were wearing security guard uniforms, official-looking hats, and badges, and they also had glasses and fake mustaches. These two men rang the bell at the Palace Road entrance to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum at 1:24 a.m. on March 18, 1990, the day after St. Patrick's Day. The desk security guard, young, hippie-ish guy with long curly hair named Rick Abath, was located just inside that entrance. He was behind the security desk where there were video monitors and a panic button underneath the desk for emergency purposes. He was the one that buzzed the two men inside. It was just one of many amateurish mistakes made by the guard of a museum full of millions of dollars worth of treasures. The second guard, who will only ever state his first name, Randy, in any information or interviews he's given, was doing his rounds on one of the upper floors with a flashlight and a two-way radio. Although reports vary, most credible ones say that neither of the guards were too surprised that a couple of cops would show up on this particular night to investigate a possible disturbance. It was early in the morning hours after St. Patty's Day in Boston, after all. Plus, earlier in the night, a fire alarm had gone off at the museum's carriage house outside the museum. Another thing to point out would be that for most of the museum's history, up until this point, the security at the museum, especially during the night shift, was, let's say, lax. Most night guards were like Rick and Randy, students who were making easy money at a decent gig. Randy recalls bringing his instrument to work and practicing during downtimes. Rick was looking forward to leaving this particular shift because he was planning to travel to Hartford to go to a Grateful Dead concert, and he didn't want anything getting in the way of those plans. It seems that both of the guards also said that they weren't really properly trained for the job they were supposed to do, and they pretty much just did whatever it was they thought was okay and didn't really follow any particular strict protocol. So really all that stood in the way between two thieves disguised as authority figures and millions of dollars of art was a couple of college kids who for the most part just wanted to avoid trouble. Unfortunately, this would put them both in a terrifying situation that night, one that would haunt them both for the rest of their lives. Before we get into the actual heist that took place that night, let's talk a little bit about the Gardner Museum. So what was this popular art museum that was located just down the street from the Boston Museum of Fine Arts? The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum started out as the private collection of Boston socialite Isabella Stewart Gardner. Isabella was born in New York City on April 14, 1840. She was born into a wealthy family and she attended finishing school in Paris. There she met a classmate who thought that she and this classmate's brother might be a good romantic match, so she introduced them. And that is how Isabella met Jack Gardner, and they did hit it off and were married in 1860. The couple settled on Beacon Street in Boston, and there they lived a fairly comfortable life. Jack Gardner was also a pretty well-off guy. By all accounts, Isabella was a friendly and well-liked public figure in Boston, with her distinctive red hair and freckles, and her flair for upsetting the stodgy old status quo. She was also a passionate supporter of the arts, and often helped out musicians, artists, and other creative types. She was affectionately known by many as Mrs. Jack, and she was also an avid fan of the Boston Red Sox. Despite her fairly privileged life, Mrs. Jack had her share of tragedy too. Her toddler son died of pneumonia, and she learned that she was not able to have any more children after suffering a miscarriage. To help her heal, she and Jack traveled extensively, and she began to collect art. A lot of art. Many years later, after Jack died, she received a valuable estate and plowed forward with her dream to build a Venetian-styled palace to house her art collection and establish a museum that would be open to the public and remain exactly as she had planned it out, forever. 4 stories tall and featuring an open courtyard filled with trees and flowers, the Gardner was not like other museums. For one, Isabella expressly stated in her will that after her death, the museum was to remain exactly as is. Nothing changed, nothing added, nothing removed. She had acquired an eclectic and valuable collection, but she wanted the layout and the aesthetic and everything in the museum to remain as her vision. And this was not some piddly little collection either. Mrs. Jack's museum contained some paintings that she had outbid some of the world's top collectors and museums for. In fact, she became a figure in the art world after outbidding the Louvre Museum for her beloved Vermeer, a move that horrified the Louvre at being outbid by an American. So the museum that the thieves stepped into in the early morning hours of March 18th was unchanged from the one that existed nearly 100 years before. Now, there were a few modern touches. For example, there were surveillance cameras, monitors at the guard desk, and a security system that included motion sensors that sent info back to a printer which printed out alerts. Investigate immediately. It printed out hundreds of alerts that night to an empty desk. However, the thieves were pretty savvy to what they needed to do to move around the museum without interference. They removed footage from the camera in the security director's office, and they disabled the alarm system. Plus, those guards. They couldn't let any surprise security personnel interrupt them, so the first thing they had was have Rick, the guard, call his colleague down to the security desk. While they waited for Randy to show up, the policeman engaged in idle chat with Rick until one of the men took a closer look. "Hey, you look familiar. I think I've seen your mugshot before. Do you have any ID?" Rick was confused and scared, so he handed his ID over. The men asked him to come out from behind the desk. Another no-no, as now he was separated from the panic button. But man, he really wanted to go to that Grateful Dead concert, and getting arrested wasn't in his plan, so he cooperated. When Randy showed, the policeman put the two scared and confused guards up against the wall. Each was wondering what they had done wrong. Then they were handcuffed. Then one of the men made everything crystal clear to the two guards. "Gentlemen, this is a robbery." The men duct taped Rick and Randy's faces so that they couldn't see or talk, leaving only a small spot for them to breathe. Even though they were acting aggressively enough to scare the two into not doing anything stupid, they also seemed to care that the men were as comfortable as possible. "We don't intend to hurt you, just cooperate." The guards were led into the basement, where they were cuffed to the heating pipes in the corridor by their arms and legs and forced to lay on the concrete floor. With the guards out of the way, now the main event could begin. The two men were buzzed into the museum at 1:24 a.m. and they left by the Palace Road entrance at 2:41 a.m. By the time they rounded up the guards and secured them in the basement, it was now 1:48 a.m. How do we know all this? Security director of the museum, Anthony Amore, who was hired in 2005, has gone through all the data from that night in painstaking detail, and he recreated the thieves' movements as best he could. There is a short YouTube clip detailing the 81-minute robbery. I'll leave a link below if you would like to go check that out. So the two men made their way directly to the second floor of the museum and headed straight to the Dutch room. There they took two Rembrandt paintings by taking the frames off the wall and cutting them right out of the frames. Leaving a shower of 300-plus-year-old paint chips all over the floor. They took the Concert by Vermeer off a tabletop display by smashing the glass. And they also took the painting on the other side of that display, a Flink painting that was thought for a long time to actually be a Rembrandt. They also took a tiny Rembrandt self-portrait etching across from the Vermeer. In the meantime, one of the men was traveling from the Dutch room, down a hallway, into the early Italian room, through the Raphael room, and into his destination, the Short Gallery. From this room, he took 5 works by Degas. Before leaving, they also took the finial and the goo from the Dutch room and the finial from the Short Gallery. At first, many thought that the finial and the goo were afterthoughts or not important, until it is realized how much actual work it was to remove those two items. For the finial, one of the men had to climb up onto a tabletop to get it off the Napoleonic banner. The goo was displayed on a tabletop covered by a silk cloth. Easy, right? Until you realize that there is a heavy, thin plate of metal that the goo is anchored to through the cloth. The 13th item stolen that night is an anomaly. It's Manet's Chez Tortoni, an oil painting. It was hanging in the blue room on the first floor of the museum. Why is it an anomaly? Because no alarms were set off that night on the first floor. The thieves would have had to go by the motion detectors twice without setting them off, which according to a security expert interviewed by the Last Seen podcast would have been impossible. The last recorded movement in the museum is at 2:41 a.m. Both men exit through the door they arrived in, closing it behind them. They drive away from the museum and disappear along with 13 stolen works of art. Did they head to the turnpike or the interstate? Did they meet a van and transfer the art? Did they head to a warehouse or holding location? Despite many theories, nobody actually knows for sure. All we know is that night was the last time any of these priceless works of art were known to have existed. And here are the 13 pieces of art that were stolen from the Gardner Museum on the night of March 18th. 1990. The Concert by Vermeer, one of only 36 known paintings by the artist. The Storm on the Sea of Galilee by Rembrandt, his only known seascape. A Lady and Gentleman in Black by Rembrandt. Self-Portrait, a tiny etching by Rembrandt. Landscape with Obelisk by an artist named Flink. This was originally thought to be a Rembrandt painting, but Flink is kind of like a contemporary or protege of Rembrandt, and it has been attributed to him. Chez Tortoni by Manet. La Sortie de Passage by Edgar Degas. This was one of the 5 works from the Short Gallery that the thieves stole. Is a pencil and watercolor on paper. Then there is Cortège aux Environs de Florence, a pencil sketch with a rose wash on paper. 3 Mounted Jockeys by Degas, an ink sketch with rose, flesh, and white washes on paper, and 2 versions of a charcoal on paper entitled Program for an Artistic Soiree. Those complete the 5 Degas works that were stolen. And as you can tell, most of them weren't even like completed works. They were just kind of ideas or sketches. The last 2 items that were taken were the ancient Chinese gu. This is a 2.7 pound Chinese bronze beaker from the Shang dynasty, which is about 1200 BC. And the last item was the French imperial eagle finial from a Napoleonic flagstaff. Now begins 30 years of dead ends, theories, wild goose chases, and unanswered questions. Coming up in part 2, a look at the suspects and theories in the largest art heist in the world, and why the thieves may be known, but the location of the art isn't, and how the world's greatest art thief wasn't involved in the heist, but may have ended up with the loot. I hope you'll join me for part 2. In the meantime, I hope you like, subscribe, and turn on the bell to be notified when the next video is uploaded. I will have part 2 ready next week, and I hope you've enjoyed watching part 1. I will see you next time. Thank you for watching. Bye!